Awesome. So just looking at the time here, and it's 5:34. So we'll just get started so we can have a chance to speak to our panelists and not cut into any of that time tonight. So thank you all for being here tonight. We really look forward to the conversations that are going to come out of this session. My name is Noreen Mabiza, and I'm an energy coordinator with the Ecology Action Center. Firstly, I would like to start by acknowledging that I am speaking to you from the unceded traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq here in Chibuktuk. As we discuss issues of our shared environment, climate change, and justice, it is critical to remember our relationship to this land and to take leadership from the Mi'kmaq people in their continued relationship to this land, Mi'kmaqi. Most of us are visitors here on this territory, and I ask that we all consider this and the land on which we walk as we continue with today's discussions. And with that, I would like to call on Elder Albert Marshall to give us a welcoming.
Thank you very much. On behalf of my ancestors and our elders here in Unamagi, Cape Breton, I'd like to extend a deep and warmest welcome to everyone here. We will try to be mindful that the task that is before us, to remind ourselves it is not a regional issue, it is not a national issue, it is a global issue. And I do hope that these talks here will somehow resonate to that concept of engaging our voices to resonate in a global scale. Because whatever happens or doesn't happen in one end of our wonderful world will ultimately affect and impact us here. So I believe there is a great need for us to stretch our arms to the world and see, and how can we all come together as one and work together for the common objective as to how can we begin this process of mitigating and healing our Mother Earth, because she is sick. What would it take for all of us to admit that we have allowed others to compromise the carrying capacity of the system, and we have allowed others to compromise the cleansing capacity of our system. So I believe wholeheartedly we no longer have the luxury to keep silent, to be in denial that we have actually allowed our system to be compromised to a point now in which there is so much uncertainty, to a point where I believe this COVID-19 is something that we should take it at heart, that it has sending us a message. The message is, of course, are we going to allow what we do in the future to be business as usual? Or are we going to do some inner reflection and really seriously look at where we come from and how we got here, and at what expense and harm we have caused to the very source of life in which we all depend upon? So I'm hoping that whatever the outcome of this gathering here somehow will resonate to that fact, that the sooner that we come together as one and start planning and send a message to the policymakers that this rate of destruction cannot continue, not only for this generation, but we also have to be very mindful of what lies for the future generations. So this is the only thing that I can say at this juncture, which I hope will somehow resonate to something that's going to be much more effective of changing the way in which our source of life has been used as a commodity. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Elder Albert Marshall. So once again, thank you all for joining us tonight. This is the first episode in the Ecology Action Center's 4-part webinar series called Mobilizing for a Just and Sustainable Future. Tonight's webinar focuses on climate goals and community realities. If you're here, you probably already know that the next decade is crucial in the fight to dial back the climate crisis, and that governments have started implementing policy pieces in order to address this crisis. Here in our province, we have the Sustainable Development Goals Act, SDGA, which came into legislation in 2019, but is still an empty shell and is awaiting a public consultation process to inform regulations and the associated climate plan. The purpose of tonight's session is to understand the moment we are in and start getting a sense of what we want and can do. It is our hope that the conversations we have here will inspire you to engage with the upcoming policy moment and help to ensure that the SDGA is built in a way that is rooted in our community realities. We at the EAC believe it is up to all of us here to create enough political pressure so we can achieve the future we want to see. There are so many solutions out there, and we know that one person doesn't have all the answers. Climate goals can touch on so many aspects of our community, and our efforts need to address this by being really broad and leaving no one behind. What you'll notice tonight is we have a panel of community experts coming from very diverse backgrounds, an intentional effort by us so as to reflect the various realities that exist here in Mi'kma'ki. You're going to hear about the intersections between the disability justice and climate justice movements, energy efficiency opportunities for our communities, efforts to fight environmental racism, a Mi'kmaq-owned wind energy project based here in our province, and about two-eyed seeing, a concept balancing traditional Aboriginal knowledge and contemporary science. We hope you enjoy the perspectives all our panelists will offer. And with that, let me hand it over to our moderator, Erica Butler. Erica is a former transportation columnist with the Halifax Examiner, now living and reporting in Sackville, New Brunswick. She's interested in how individuals and communities solve problems, from the climate crisis to inequality to social justice. So welcome, Erica. I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Noreen. I appreciate that. And hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here learning along with you all. Some housekeeping notes just to begin with. For those of us joining on Zoom, closed captioning is available. There should be a button at the bottom of your screen that you can turn on to show subtitles. And keep in mind, it is an auto-generated system. So unfortunately, I'm told it's not incredibly accurate, but it's pretty good. Everyone in the audience has their mics and video off. So don't worry about making sure you're muted. It's all taken care of. If you have questions as we go, you can put them in the chat window, or there's a Q&A window, and we'll do our best to get to them in a Q&A session at the end of, after all the speakers have presented. We have about 15 minutes reserved at the end for that. A note that we're also broadcasting on Facebook Live, so just so you know that. And I'm going to be giving really brief introductions for today's speakers, just in the interest of maximizing the time we have to hear them speak. So if you want to find out more about them, please check out their bios on the webinar event page, or or elsewhere. We're going to hear from each participant now. And we're starting with Elder Albert Marshall. Albert Marshall, you've just heard from him, is a leading environmental voice in Unama'ki, Cape Breton. He advises and lectures internationally on a wide range of topics and is the creator of Two-Eyed Seeing, a concept of the Two-Eyed Seeing concept, balancing traditional Aboriginal knowledge and contemporary science. Hi, Albert. I'm wondering if you could share some knowledge with us today about the concept of Two-Eyed Seeing and how we can use it in our everyday lives.
Thank you very much. Two-eyed seeing, of course, is a concept in which I believe is and was very much inherent to our Aboriginal Aboriginal ways of thinking. It wasn't I that invented that concept, but rather 25 years ago it became essential that we somehow coin it in a way in which people can probably clearly see and understand the idea and the benefit that could be if we were to coin it as 2I seen. In this case, for example, I, as a Mi'kmaq person, I happen to view and see everything from my Aboriginal lens. Everything that has been ingrained into my culture from my ancestors, in which I look at the world from that lens. But since now I have to coexist with the other people that came from different parts of the world, I also invoke my other lens and always seek as to what I can learn, what other perspective or concepts could I learn to improve the way I will be able to meet the challenges, even for the present and for the future. And of course, 2I seen, of course, is very, very effective, especially if you are an Aboriginal speaker, because in our case, for example, as a Mi'kmaq, we have words like Nedugulim. Nedugulim, of course, gives you a privilege as to how you can go about sustaining yourself, but also it's a constant reminder that no matter what action you take, you cannot and should not compromise the ecological integrity of the area, because we are so very much reminded and very mindful that this natural world we call Mother Earth is a very source of life in which we all depend upon. Therefore, why would anyone deliberately cause and harm to that something that we solely depend upon? And as we speak, we know and we are convinced that the carrying capacity of the system has been compromised, and the cleansing capacity of the system has been compromised. But yet, for some reason, the policymakers, the governments, and the industry are more than willing to compromise not only this generation here, but the future generations to the very source of life in which water, air, and soil does not even have any kind of a protection. I hope I'm 82 years of age now. I hope I will never live long enough in which I will have to wear a canister on my back so I can inhale that clean oxygen I need to survive. So 2I seen then to me has to be very much action oriented, in which once we look at a situation or an issue, we also have to strive as to how can we improve it. And in our case with the climate change, if an action is not ecologically sustainable, then why would we continuously apply that destructive thing? And when I invoke my 2I seen, I have to look at from my community perspective. If any development is to come to my area, I think I have the right to question: is this project going to be ecologically? If this going to be ecologically sustainable? And if it's not, then do I have some say that either go back and come up with a project that is not going to cause as much harm to the environment as this project here? So for the sake of economics, we are being forced to be in denial, in silent, for the sake of this economic opportunity for the select few. So everything that's been proposed, even in our community here in Eskasoni, it's all going to be based on who's going to benefit economically. And no one is very cognizant of what harm will this do to the very source of life in which we all depend upon. Everything is based so much on social economics. And I have to somehow challenge that somehow to the best of my ability, in which climate change to me is a process. What we should be looking at very seriously when I invoke my Aboriginal lens is that when are we going to look at the situation and begin to use this very tool that has been used against us, which is science. Science has been very, very effective of training us to be a number one exploiter. Now, as I invoke my 2IC, here's an energy that is very, very effective, science. Why can't we use this very, very tool of destruction and transform it to a tool of renewal, so that not only this generation here, but for the future generations would also have the same opportunities as we have, and hopefully better. So this short-term planning, I think, is the root cause of the state of our environment at this point, because we have allowed someone else to compromise the integrity of our areas, in which there is no concern for the survival of these people, especially as an Aboriginal person. You know, we're constantly trying to address this environmental racism, social racism, but yet we're constantly trying to strive of trying to get that message out. This is not an Aboriginal issue. This is not a regional issue. This is not a national issue. This is a global issue. So when are we going to really think about what we are doing and try to come together as one and apply the gifts that we all have been given of ensuring that everyone, not only this generation here, but also for the next the next 7 generations, they too will have the same opportunity, hopefully better. Because if we don't do that, do we know exactly when will we reach the point of no return? And in my humble opinion, as a layman, I strongly feel that we have exhausted the carrying capacity of the system. We have exhausted the cleansing capacity of the system. And I believe it's just going to be just a matter of time before we come to this point of no return. Thank you.
Albert, it sounds a lot like applying an Aboriginal lens. It tells us that we need to, use this powerful tool, like you described, science and technology. We need to use this powerful tool to answer questions that take us into longer term visions of where we belong in the world. What do you see as when you see applying that two-eyed seeing lens to the climate crisis? How do you think how do you think you can sort of convince governments who are short-term by nature to apply that long-term thinking lens?
Well, I look at it at the source of our problem at this juncture. And the source of a problem that I see, how did we get to where we are now? What instruments were used on us to train us to be a number one exploiter? And I have to say, it's through the education system. The education system has been very, very effective of transforming us to be an efficient exploiter. Now, isn't it about time that we transform this very system to lead us into renewal and mitigation? We have the ability. We have something in which called science. We can transform this very tool not to be the arm of destruction, but rather the arm of renewal. We can use this science to begin to mitigate and to renew some of the areas that have been heavily impacted whether it's through toxins, whether it's through any kind of a extraction like forestry, for example, and even in fishery. Because to us, the key here is how can we be instrumental of being transforming our world so that biodiversity will always be used of generating more biodiversity. But if this rate of destruction, if this rate of extraction continues, what are we doing? I believe we are playing into the hands of in which we will be very, very soon reach this point of no return. I don't believe, as a non-educated person, I don't think we are that naive not to believe that something there needs to be some kind of a transformative change at this very moment. But first of all, we have to identify what that transformative change is. And together, don't look at me as an Aboriginal. Look at me as someone that I have something to contribute. And I look upon you in the same way. Let's tear down those boundaries that have been dividing us, which cost us those divisions. Those divisions don't have room for that now. We need to unite as one and start thinking about the future. If I was any younger, I would be concerned for my great-grandchildren, and I do. And I know that if and when they ask me, what did you do? Well, I may not have done much, but at least I kept talking about something in which hopefully would somehow resonate, in which people would do things differently. Differently, that could be construed as ecologically sustainable. Every action that we are taking now is not ecologically sustainable because socioeconomics is an overriding factor. Yes, we need economics, but I believe we can create just as many economic opportunities if we were to, say, turn to green energy, if we were to transform our community to green areas. You know, our total lifestyle at this juncture, I think, has to be transformed in a 90-degree angle. I don't know how much more I can emphasize that. Are we that blind? Are we that whatever, not to see that what's happening, what has happened, is the result of what we are subject to now, for example, this COVID-19 or whatever, the severity of storms. So I don't know who to talk to from here on in of conveying that message that there is a great need of some kind of a transformative change. We have not admitted yet there is a need for transformative change. And if we do agree there is a need for transformation, let's talk about it. And what can we do? What can we do to improve our chances for the future? So these are some of the questions I'm asking. And I'm constantly asking, why is it only the Aboriginal people are very, 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 very aggressively trying to convey that message and even take an action? For example, our grandmothers trying to protect that river at Stewiacke River are fighting it for a long time. But yet rest of the residents in Nova Scotia are silent. The question is why? This is not an Aboriginal issue. What they are trying to do was create an awareness that this business cannot be as usual anymore. We have to find a better way in which we can sustain ourselves without causing such harm to the very source of life in which we all depend upon. I don't know if that kind of answers your question, but I'm trying my best to articulate it the best way I know how.
That's great. No more business as usual. And I have high hopes that we can get rid of those boundaries and solve these problems. Thank you so much for that, Elder Albert Marshall. I appreciate it. Next up today, we're going to hear from Caden Flynn. Caden is a 19-year-old student from St. Mary's University. He was born with cerebral palsy, which is a neurological disorder that affects movement in his limbs. From a young age, Caden has been an advocate for inclusion and accessibility for those living with disabilities, and he's also been a climate activist. Caden, to start off, I was hoping you could tell us a bit more about your experience within the climate justice movement as someone who's living within a disability. What are some of the challenges that you've faced there?
Yeah, for sure. So not only myself, but many of my peers who also live with disabilities, when we're entering the climate justice movement, the biggest thing that I found was at first, specifically here in Halifax, and I'm sure this is an issue elsewhere as well, kind of just the lack of intersectionality, to realize that climate issues are disability issues and vice versa, and also the way we perform our activism. For instance, for someone like me and many others, uh, participating in a strike, in a physical strike, can be quite the challenge or sometimes impossible. But through conversation with other members of School Strike for Halifax, we were able to accommodate as many people as possible. So what that looked like, I'll give a specific example, what that looked like, and this was pre-coronavirus. We started having it so that I was always, if we were marching, I would stay at the front or very close to the front of the line of people. And the theory was, if I'm having a hard time keeping up, there's probably others having a hard time, and slow it down. We stopped often. And then this summer, accommodating for COVID, we decided not only would the most COVID safe thing be, but also the most accessible thing be to have, I'm not sure if anyone saw, we basically held a sit-in at City Hall where speeches were given. And so that was very unique. And I was glad to see lots of people who told me that they wouldn't have been able to come had this been the traditional, marching through the streets. So overall, to answer your question, it was difficult at first just because there was a lack of conversation around how these identities and these issues intersected, but I think it's definitely improving, but I also think we have a long way to go.
Oh, sorry. Caden, what do you think, what could strong climate goals do for you and your community? What's inspiring you there? What's driving you?
What's driving me personally is, as a young person, quite honestly, the looming threat of our climate terrifies me. And I know it terrifies a lot of other young people. I mean, there's a term for it now, climate anxiety. And that's something I definitely suffer with, and a lot of other youth. But I also want to give other disabled people, and quite honestly, when we're talking about any social issue, disabled people are just asking for a seat at the table. And so I don't want to say I felt obligated to get involved, but I wasn't seeing it happen. I wasn't seeing other disabled people have their voices heard. And some of the most contentious issues around sustainability do directly affect disabled people. For instance, the concept of getting rid of single-use plastic straws. I'm not one of the people that this has generally affected, or I don't struggle to use reusable straws, but there are some people within the disabled community that very much do. And, due to various issues, a single-use plastic straw might be the best and safest option for them. And so they ended up feeling like this drop in the bucket effort to be more sustainable by corporations completely left us out of the picture. Also, when people are being encouraged to, walk to work, bike to work, all great things. However, I also want to see, and we need to see, investments in clean and renewable public transit, because I know myself personally, walking to my part-time job is not an option. And so we also need to realize, not to ramble, but for certain people living, especially in rural places, not all of their activities at this current stage can be sustainable because of their disability. And so me personally, my goal is to create a heightened sense of awareness that we are here, we want a seat at the table, and it all intersects. I remember, I think Elder Albert brought up the COVID-19 pandemic. That has been, that has really exposed some glaring issues really around inclusion and accessibility. Personally, I had issues or I kind of took issue, I should say, with the fact that for years disabled people have been asking to work from home, trying to get jobs at corporations while working from home. And we were always told we couldn't do that, that wasn't possible. And yet, of course, this is a good thing, but the COVID-19 pandemic has showed us that almost any job can be done remotely. But it does kind of heighten how, although we were calling for that for years, we were ignored until it became inconvenient for abled people as well. I know I kind of rambled, but to answer your question, I'm here to make sure, like, a sustainable climate goals involving disabled people for us means having a seat at the table, because I'm not the expert on everyone's disability. I'm very grateful to have this platform today to be able to speak, but I'm only one perspective. We need to broaden our goals to have a wide variety of perspectives, because no two people are the same and no two disabled people's needs are the same.
Thanks so much for that, Caden. Yeah, it's interesting points you're making there. And especially COVID-19 in so many ways has shown us a lot of things that are possible that a lot of people didn't think were possible a year ago, or just over a year ago. Next up, I want to introduce Steve Parsons, who is a teacher, economic development consultant, and now the CEO of the Eskasoni First Nations Corporate Division. Steve is also a newly elected member of the CBRM Council. Steve, welcome. And can you tell us about the Mi'kmaq-owned wind, and we also mentioned other renewable energy projects that you've been involved in, and what has contributed to making them so successful?
Thank you, Erica, and thank you for the invitation to participate this evening. I had the opportunity to be engaged with the first Mi'kmaq wind projects in the province back in 2002. The Department of Energy of Nova Scotia, along with Nova Scotia Power, created a community feed and tariff program, which was open to communities generally, and or the Mi'kmaq Nation as 13 collective bands. So through the Assembly of Chiefs, we created a company that would see this, would realize it, would develop it, and proud to say today that over 30 megawatts of wind energy is being developed by the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia, and we're just hoping that another community feed and tariff program comes along so we can keep going in wind. But wind at the time back in 2002 was coming on stream in Canada, and the Nova Scotia government saw fit to carve off some development for the Mi'kmaq, and the Mi'kmaq decided to get into the renewable energies sector. And today we're like I say, we're proud to develop 30 megawatts ourselves as Eskasoni and Millbrook. We share a 5 wind turbine project in Truro, and again, under that community feed and tariff, we partnered up with a developer over a 14-month period. We developed, and today we have 5 windmills. I'm sure a lot of people see them as you drive to Halifax. So that's 2 projects that's owned by Mi'kmaq communities. But again, it was an opportunity to get into the renewables, create some revenue streams for the bands, and now we continue on the renewable energy stream by getting into solar. In our own community of Eskasoni, we have 2 solar projects. One a ground mount system and another 70 kilowatt system on our community hall. So again, open for more opportunities, and again, all in reference to renewables, sustainability, and we just want to play a part.
It sounds like, those feed-in tariffs really played a big part in making it possible for these projects to take off. if, if you were to give advice to communities who might want to get into renewables at this point, what kind of, what nuggets of wisdom do you have to share with them?
A couple of very important ones. Of course, like any new sector that you're getting into, you're dependent on somebody else in terms of developing because of their capacity. We didn't have any capacity when we started this road in this sector, but today we do. So my advice would be to surround yourself with good partners, build that relationship, ask those pertinent questions. These projects aren't cheap to get into. They're very expensive, but there's avenues and support out there for communities to get engaged. And I would think that pay attention, ask lots of questions, create the knowledge base that you need to carry on forward, so you can do it yourself and not have to depend on a developer to take you to that next level and get engaged.
What do you consider to be like the benefits to the community? I guess besides the straight economic, like you have a stake in an energy production, are there further benefits that you're seeing in the community?
Absolutely. There's a couple that comes to mind. One would be playing our part and protecting the environment, engaging in renewable energies to get off fossil fuels, for example. That's why Nova Scotia Power is engaged to get their consumption down with coal, and they've agreed over a period of time they will get that down. Number two is the transfer of knowledge to younger people, getting engaged with the technology, acquiring the skills to be able to maintain and operate these facilities, and install them. For example, as part of the construction of these windmills, we engage with the community in terms of employables. So there was certainly an employment opportunity, a knowledge-based opportunity, and going further, because now we've gained that knowledge, we can do these projects ourselves without depending on somebody else.
So you've really you're growing the homegrown expertise basically, and you're using renewables as an economic driver.
Yes, but at the same time, protecting the environment by using the technology that reduces fossil fuels and the consumption of, and therefore that protection of the environment.
Yeah. You were mentioning earlier that there's a crossover that you have with some other industries that Eskasoni is involved in, that now you're able to start using renewable energies to, say, power the refrigerator system that is being used to store lobster, things like that.
Correct. Eskasoni is the owner of a 65,000 square foot facility in Sydney, of which we store frozen bait for next year's fisheries, lobster and crab fisheries. And of course, you need somewhere to store that. So we've got into the business of providing for that service. And as one of our identifiable costs to running that is energy. To keep frozen bait at a temperature of -23, you've got to use a lot of compressors to do that. So we're working today on and we'll foresee in the near future a $1.5 million solar panel ground mount system. And just the installation of that system, we look forward to cutting our energy costs at 35% monthly of that cost. So again, it's doing it for economics, but at the same time, it reduces those energy need for, in this case, electricity that's provided by Nova Scotia Power using coal. So I think the more systems we get on the grid, that will reduce that dependency of coal and thus reducing the carbon emissions in the atmosphere.
All right. Thanks so much for telling us about that today, Steve. I really appreciate it.
And before I go, I just want to mention, I've got to sign off at 6:30. So you guys got all my information. If anybody would like any further information or specific questions, please reach out to me, and I'm glad to help out where I can.
Thanks very much, Steve. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Our next guest speaker is Jessika Hepburn. She's a community organizer, entrepreneur, and co-owner of the wonderful Biscuit Eater Cafe and Books in Mahone Bay. Jessika serves as secretary for SEED, the South End Environmental and Justice Society. SEED is based in Shelburne, Nova Scotia, and dedicated to ending environmental racism, ensuring access to clean water, and reparations for Black residents of South End Shelburne, which is home to the oldest free Black community in North America and the location of the first race riots. Jessika, I want to start off asking you about SEED. What role does the organization play in addressing environmental injustice in the Shelburne community?
A number of roles right now. SEED was started in 2016 by Louise DeLille, and that came out of work that was done by Dr. Ingrid Waldron, Dr. Lynn Jones, to raise awareness about the impact of environmental racism on Black and African Nova Scotian communities. There was a dump that was located in the historically Black community of the south end of Shelburne that was never remediated. And for over, I believe it was 70 years, there was medical waste, household garbage, industrial garbage that was dumped and burnt regularly. And those concerns and those health concerns have never been addressed. That was one of the things that was part of the documentary that was based on Dr. Ingrid Waldron's book, There's Something in the Water. That documentary of the same name definitely raised global awareness of SEED's work to address the fact that there are still residents, Black residents of the south end of Shelburne that do not have access to clean water or that are dealing with contaminated water. The link to whether there's leachate from the dump site has yet to be made formally, but there is repeatedly when water tests have been done by SEED in partnership with Rural Water Watch and also in partnership with Dalhousie University. Every year those tests have come back positive for coliform and E. coli. And the funds and the infrastructure necessary to maintain these private wells in ways in which residents are having access to clean water has not been put in place. So SEED has been independently trying to work with the town of Shelburne to put in a community well. Director Elliot Page has offered to pay for that well, and there's still been consistent roadblocks. So even though we know that clean water is a right for all people, the fact that there is continuously barriers put in place for us even meeting those needs for our own communities. So one of the things that SEED is doing right now is hosting a GoFundMe campaign to provide clean water for Shelburne's Black community by purchasing UV treatment units for Black houses that are impacted by having contaminated water. And that's one way that we can help address that issue immediately while pushing for more systemic solutions. On what we've seen quite consistently is that there's funds that are allocated towards dealing with environmental racism, but they very rarely trickle down. Quite often they go to studies and to policies that don't necessarily impact the people on the ground. So these sorts of grassroots initiatives like SEED that are by the community, for the community, that are deeply connected to the concerns of the people that are living it are integral.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When you look at there's historical environmental racism and there's current environmental racism, so much to take on. How do you think the Nova Scotia government should be addressing this?
Yeah, I've got two answers. The first one is I asked Louise DeLille to share their responses to these three questions because they weren't able to be here tonight. And I am a woman of Black and Jewish descent, but I definitely do not attempt to speak for African Nova Scotian communities. So I wanted to be able to share Louise's words, and she gave us some pretty clear ones. So she says the government tends to lower their heads when it comes to environmental racism. The disparities of environmental racism are entirely the fault of the government. And the situation is simple. When government officials or other individuals or groups in power are faced with the decision of where to place the newest hazardous waste facility or dump site, they typically do not want it to be placed in their backyard. And instead, they decide to place these hazardous waste facilities and dump sites in communities filled with people who do not look like them or fall under the same tax bracket. The government needs to focus on education of what environmental racism is in these government positions like town councilors. Just because the dump is no longer operating in the Black community, the fight with environmental racism is far from over. There needs to be government orders to address all these issues that stem from environmental racism in communities like Shelburne. We need an office to address these issues in the community. The government needs to pass firm legislation about environmental racism and conduct a large-scale study on the effect of environmental racism to fully understand the impact on the Black community in Shelburne. So those are, Louise's very clear suggestions on what the government needs to do. That all levels of government have a tendency to pass the buck. So the municipal government says, well, that's actually the provincial government's responsibility. And the provincial government says, well, actually, that's the federal government's responsibility. And then the federal government hands it back down to the municipal government. But what we're saying is, these are not only human rights issues, these are responsibilities of the government to address the harms that they've done.
Thanks for that, Jessika. What do you think strong climate goals could mean for you and your community, and and the Shelburne community as well?
Right. Well, I think what we address what strong climate goals mean, I think we need to look at what is, again, like who's responsible. If we know that 100 companies produce up to 71% of emissions, strong climate goals need to be holding those large polluters, those large corporations, the people who are responsible for dump sites, such as the one in Shelburne. So that's municipalities, but also the military, holding them accountable to clean up and to reduce emissions, to implement solutions for our communities that come from within the community. So I think we'd see a lot of solutions like access to clean water, number one, right? That we shouldn't have communities in a country such as Canada that don't have access to clean drinking water. We know that the climate crisis is going to impact our access to water over time. So solving these issues immediately now that are historical and systemic and continuing is going to help us avoid larger crises in the future. We know that the people who are most impacted by a climate crisis and the climate change are the people who are most disproportionately not responsible for it or have the capacity to respond to it.
Thanks so much for that, Jessika. I really appreciate hearing from you. Last but not least, guys, we're a little bit ahead of schedule here, but last but not least, we're going to hear from Brendan Haley, who is the Policy Director for Efficiency Canada, a research and advocacy group based out of Carleton University. Nova Scotians may remember Brendan from his time as Energy Coordinator at the Ecology Action Centre, where he helped bring about the creation of Efficiency Nova Scotia. Brendan, energy efficiency has obviously been a top priority for you in your career. Tell us why energy efficiency is important in addressing climate change.
Right, well, there's a huge potential to address climate change through energy efficiency. So just to put that into some perspective, only about 35% of the energy produced for domestic use in the province actually provides useful services. The rest of that energy is lost in conversion or it's wasted. So there's a huge technical potential there to reduce emissions, and it's only really constrained by our lack of ingenuity and some of our current policy and market structures. Perhaps most importantly, those emission reductions that you can get from efficiency gains can happen almost as a spin-off to initiatives that are really about producing a better quality of life. So we know that often when people improve energy efficiency, what they're really seeking is other improvements, like a home that's more comfortable, that's healthier, that doesn't have temperature swings, that doesn't have air leakage, that can cause problems with mold or bad air quality. When we think about climate change, the resilience of our building stock is going to become much more important with temperature swings and extreme weather. So I think this is also an equity issue because we need to provide equitable access to those health and resilience benefits of energy efficiency. If you just think of one example, a lot of tenancy agreements do not require landlords to disallow, extreme heat in apartment units, right? And that burdens on lower income populations. That's going to become more important. So a bit of a plug, Efficiency Canada right now is running a campaign for national funding for low income efficiency, because thus far that's been left out. So there's a tool to write to your MP if you go to the Efficiency Canada website right now. Other aspects I'd say is that demand side solutions, they actually make all the other zero carbon solutions work much better. So when we think about renewables, if we really want to go forward with renewables, we're going to have to also think about producing and storing energy, right? Storing energy for when those renewables are available. Well, a really well insulated hot water tank or refrigerator or a building, is an energy storage technology, right? So there's lots of complementaries there. And finally, efficiencies in Nova Scotia Advantage. We track savings performance, policy performance in the different jurisdictions, and Nova Scotia is frequently on top of those program savings metrics, but we're still just scratching, that potential.
I'm interested in, that's interesting how it can, focusing on efficiency and tying it in with equity and, setting standards for things like affordable housing to be efficient is like an interesting intersection of different goals there, but both good goals. What should the Nova Scotia government be focusing on with regards to energy efficiency policies? Like how can we get the provincial government to push these goals forward so that we'll see more of this in action in our buildings?
Sure. So Nova Scotia has been really successful at administering energy efficiency programs. So that's mostly been led by Efficiency Nova Scotia and the wider sector. But what has been missing, I'd say, to an extent that you see in jurisdictions like BC that you don't see in Nova Scotia, is really a government partner that works on that mission by coupling those programs, that are offered by utilities with an agenda that changes the nature of markets by establishing mandatory benchmarks. So things Nova Scotia could do right away is it could, immediately commit to adopting a building code requiring all new buildings to be net zero energy ready and not using fossil fuels. It could require energy use labels whenever a building is sold or rented. It could create minimum performance standards for existing buildings that those buildings have to meet over time. And finally, just I think last week, the province came out with a new renewable target. And you can actually create targets like that for efficiency too, right? You can actually establish mandatory and long-term minimum savings targets for electricity and for reduction in fossil fuel use in the same way that we require Nova Scotia Power to meet a certain percentage of its electricity from renewable resources. So those would be the top of my list for policy action and advocacy in the province right now.
All right. Do you think that strong energy efficiency policies like that would help contribute to more green jobs?
Yeah, actually, we ran a study on this for the country, and we actually had an economic model that estimated the job impacts of really ramping up energy efficiency. So if Nova Scotia doubled its electricity savings, about tripled its fossil fuel savings, that would create between now and say 2030, that would create about 6,000 annual jobs. So that's about a 1.4% boost in current employment. So it's definitely, that's, if you think about that as a drop in unemployment, that's very large. So those jobs are local. There's a lot of people working in a place like Trinity Maintenance Solutions in Pictou that otherwise have said they'd be working in, Alberta. And I'd also emphasize that there's a lot of different types of jobs. Obviously the construction trades, there's a lot of jobs involved in the efficiency sector there, but we also need data analysts and project managers and marketing specialists. And the more creative we need to be about savings, the more we're going to, have to think about different types of jobs in areas like community outreach and data analytics and finance and manufacturing. So yeah, it's a huge job creation opportunity, I think, for Nova Scotia in particular.
All right. And finally, what do you think, what climate policies are missing in Nova Scotia?
Yeah, as I mentioned, I'd say that efficiency targets, just like renewable targets, building codes is kind of an obvious one. When you're in a hole, you need to stop digging. So we should not be letting any new buildings be built in the province right now that are not highly efficient and zero carbon. Yeah, those are, what really is missing is that government partner, with Efficiency Nova Scotia, coupling not just running programs that give incentives, but actually creating mandatory standards for what the market norm needs to be.
Mm-hmm. And how radical would setting goals like that be? Do you think policy wise for Nova Scotia? Is that something that you've observed in other jurisdictions? Like, can we point to elsewhere, which is always a useful thing when you're talking about
Right.
Scotia setting goals?
Yes, this is all happening in other jurisdictions. So, I mean, British Columbia has already adopted this type of building code. Minimum performance standards, we see those now in the city of Vancouver happening. Energy use labels, unfortunately, not so much in Canada, but in places like Oregon, we see that happening. And some of the, American states that we'd like to compete with, and if you compare, Nova Scotia's energy savings, they're quite impressive, but they're not as high as jurisdictions like Massachusetts or Vermont or Rhode Island. And what those jurisdictions have are those, mandatory targets and standards for energy savings. So actually, none of this is new. It would just be best practices that can be emulated.
All right. Thanks so much, Brendan. I appreciate you sharing all that information. We're now going to open things up to questions, and we've seen a few roll in through the chat windows. I'm going to go ahead and ask a few. Please feel free to ask your question in the chat window on Facebook Live or on the Zoom, wherever you find the space, wherever is easiest. We had a question here just from Navjot for Brendan, actually, who is wondering, when we say affordable housing, am I correct that it's houses that will operate, that houses will operate more efficiently in terms of their energy use? So I guess the question is, if we set, goals and regulations for affordable housing, does it even make housing more affordable? Oh, we need Brendan on here. There he is.
Yeah. I was trying to, always mute, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, if you own your own house, it's more affordable. If you rent, we need to couple efficiency investments in rental properties and multi-unit buildings with things like security of tenure for tenants and, agreements that do not lead to an increase. And, there's things that can be done there where essentially what would have been spent on energy is replaced with, those energy efficiency upgrades. So I think, making the affordable housing stock we do have, so things like government supported housing, highly energy efficient, makes a lot of sense, because we get those operational savings that, pushes downward pressure on those rents. And really importantly, even if you don't pay your own energy bill, it's those access to adequate heating and cooling that is a really important issue for everyone, especially as we face more climate extremes. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, there's one more. I'm just gonna go with this for you, Brendan. There's a couple here regarding that. Isaac is asking, how might we balance housing affordability and efficiency targets for building codes? So in other words, are they in conflict or complementary? If you can almost hear some developers saying, if you put in more strict, fancier building codes, then housing is going to get more expensive. How does that parse out?
Right. So highly efficient buildings right now are being built at the same cost of, typical buildings. And often when you see projections of, the costs being quite high, it's the same type of building and just kind of adding more insulation into it, whereas, or adding kind of add-on energy efficiency. But, if you follow a good integrated design process, if you actually design the building right from the beginning, if you think about savings, like if you, insulate and air seal properly, you actually spend a lot less money on heating, right, on those HVAC systems. So it's possible to build a building at the exact same cost right now. We just need to have the design principles and practices to do that. But I think most important, especially for, someone who's of low or moderate income, I mean, if you can afford to build your own house, you can afford to make it energy efficient. I think that's clear. But often people who are renters or who might be buying a house, they're stuck with the operational costs of that building, right? Of that building not being built right in the first hand. So it's really important to build those buildings properly and to high performance so that whoever owns that building or is a renter in that building isn't stuck with those higher operational costs.
Reminds me of the sort of looking farther into the future with a longer term vision that Albert Marshall was talking about in Two-Eyed Seeing, using the tools of technology that we have to, you know, do something that is sustainable in the long term and doesn't have the same ecological impact that we have been having. There's a question here from Joanna, and that I think is really for everybody. I'm gonna read it and throw it out there and then see if I can get a volunteer. The SDGA, the Sustainable Development Goals Act, is setting policy for the next 10 years leading up to the year 2030. If you could imagine the future you want to see in 2030, what would the future look like? What do we need to demand from our government to make that future real? This is a very aspirational one. Let's see who's up for taking this on. I'm looking around here. Jessika, do you have any thoughts on what you'd like to see to, you know, in what kind of policies you'd like to see for the next 10 years leading up to 2030?
Yeah, how much time do we have? I've got so many. Definitely, I would like to see the investment go directly towards the communities that are most impacted, right? So I would like to see policies that put the focus on the lived experience of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, that we recognize that there is no policy that, that can represent our communities if our communities have not been involved. And I think that we've had enough policies that have been made with a heavy hand. So I would like to see that happen. I would like to see us, like I said earlier, hold the largest polluters accountable. I'd like to see an end to fossil fuel subsidies. I would like to see us stop buying pipelines. All of those things, definitely. The focus on affordable housing, access to good, healthy food, the end of food apartheids and food wastelands. So the focus on Indigenous and Black food sovereignty. All of these things, the recognition, like Elder Albert Marshall said, is that everything is connected. So we can't just continue to make policies in one bubble and then ignore them on the other end. So like that inclusion of people with disabilities needs to be part of all of our policies, as Caden had said, and that we need to do this work collectively.
Mm-hmm. Caden, I'm wondering if you feel like weighing in on that. What do we need to demand from this government?
So what I would like to see by 2030, and I don't have the expertise to speak on specific policies, so I'm going to speak in more broad terms. I feel myself and a lot of other youth, the government's talking to us from two faces right now. And on one hand, anytime we encounter a politician, we've actually confronted politicians on the street before. Actually, they just happened to pass by one of our actions, and unfortunately for them, they couldn't move fast enough for them to escape us. So we caught up, and they always tell us how inspiring the work we're doing is, and how important this is, and we need to keep going and keep going. And we can't help but think, but aren't you the one making these decisions? We don't want to hear how inspiring we are. What I'm doing, whether it be for climate justice or for inclusion of people with disabilities, it's not inspiring. It's tiring and it's frustrating. I need to see the government recognize that the youth don't take it as when you call us the next generation of leaders, okay, cool, but we need you to be a leader right now for us, because by the time that we're in positions of power, it might be too late. So we need you to act now. So I need to start seeing actual action happening would be great, because I remember I wasn't able to attend when these sustainable development goals were first being, when the public consultation first happened, and this was last year. And I know members of our group went to speak, and not a single point we brought up was amended or even addressed, really. And I won't ramble, but to wrap up my story, essentially, yeah, stop. I need to see I need to feel that we're being taken seriously, because by 2030, I will be 29 years old. And I worry by then, if we don't see action now, that my fate might be sealed. Yeah, so ideally, 2030, what we're looking at is my generation being able to continue the work that has already been done by this current generation of leaders.
Thanks for that, Caden. I appreciate it. Question came in here for Brendan, but it could be for everyone here. Are you optimistic that the new leader of the government, Ian Rankin, about Ian Rankin's stated sustainable objectives?
That's a good question. I'm an expatriate Nova Scotian, so I might have not been following it as closely, but I followed it fairly closely. The one thing I noted about Premier Rankin is that when he was running for the leadership, we produced this scorecard of the provinces, and Nova Scotia came in third. And he said that his platform was to make Nova Scotia come in first on the efficiency scorecard. So I'm all for that. I was enthused with the announcement last week about the renewables targets, and almost 80% of the cap and trade monies is being used for energy efficiency, especially in low income. So that's very encouraging. But I just reiterate, it's not just about money for programs, it's about the government changing the market so that those programs can be way more effective. And just like he put in a mandatory target for electricity, you can have similar mandatory regulations like that in a whole host of other energy efficiency areas. So that's what I would hope the Premier moves forward with. Mm-hmm. And that would make him come in first on that scorecard. Nova Scotia coming first, I should say.
Maybe I'll pass that question over to Albert Marshall. Albert, are you optimistic with the new leader, the new Premier Ian Rankin's stated sustainable objectives?
Well, I believe, without being optimistic, pessimistic, any leader, whether it's Rankin or otherwise, if they are not willing to look at the current policies and current legislations, where it allows someone to exercise their differences, either in the form of a, what do you call them? What's that word I'm looking for? People to be separated from the rest of the group. Like, for example, I have to speak on behalf of people that have been marginalized, Aboriginal, Black people, and other people that are somewhat disadvantaged. It seems, though, that the policies that are currently here written only are geared only to appease and to be effective for a certain class of people. To have a government that's going to be for all people, I believe whoever the leader is has to take that initiative and see how can we begin to look at our current policies and legislations that are not going to allow these things to continue, whether it's social or environmental racism, because racism is going to cost someone some money in the future to rectify it or to fix it up. Because especially when it comes to environmental racism, how naive can they think we people are? That racism does not acknowledge or recognize jurisdictions or boundaries. Whatever happens to any part of our province, ultimately and inevitably is going to affect all of us. So why are so many people are agreeing to remain silent, to remain indifferent, while these racism are being practiced openly? So I believe we need an overall a major overhaul in our policies, in which every human being, no matter what shade, color, or size, or whatever you come into, you will always be part and parcel of this legislation. Right now, apparently, there isn't. People are allowed to marginalize whoever they want, and the government remains silent. And their silence is leading up to more and more racism, whether it's environmental or social. So this is the way I see, in order for us to bring back to where we should have been, is to look at every person in this province as having the same rights as everybody else, rich or poor, whatever. So unless we begin to address this difference, whether it's social or environmental racism, or this marginalization, we're not going to come to any kind of a decision as to how can we better manage our natural world, because this is distracting us. This is directing us in the wrong direction. That we cannot come together and start planning for the brighter future.
Thanks for that, Albert. Speaking on the topic of environmental racism here, we have an issue highlighted by Lee, and this is for you, Jessika. I don't know if you will have heard of this or be able to answer this, but it's at least worth mentioning this comment here to flag this issue. In North Preston, homes have property title issues that prevent them from being eligible for things like home warming efficiency upgrades. Do you know if other African Nova Scotian communities have this title issue? And could a targeted efficiency program for African Nova Scotian communities that doesn't require clear title help?
This is a great question. I was actually writing a book in the chat. So I'm glad that I wanted to make sure that it got addressed. Yes, those are ongoing issues. The SEED has been working with, created a working group that included Housing Nova Scotia, as well as multiple other levels, to help address the fact that the well contamination issue is quite often on private land, so on individual homeowners, who are then penalized for being individual homeowners because maybe they don't have title, or they make too much money, or there's a whole bunch of other hoops that need to be jumped through. And we do know that many of people in Black communities and Indigenous communities, we don't have trust. So why would we fill out your form if we're just going to be denied? So a targeted program that reduces those barriers, that says, you live in this community, your house is this old, you are eligible for this money, would be a beginnings of making some reparations and helping to increase, make those upgrades to housing. And but if you have these programs that require people to jump through multiple hoops to give you sensitive financial information when there's been no trust built, I think that's an ongoing issue that happens with these programs. So like Lee is asking, a targeted efficiency program that eliminates those barriers, that makes it very simple to apply for upgrades, I think would be very important, and something that we've been advocating for.
Mm-hmm. Brendan, I wonder if you want to weigh in there, how important, for the housing stock that exists now, so setting building codes can affect, what we build in the future. But the housing stock that exists now, a lot of people who own are at various socioeconomic levels. And so how important is it that government fund programs to sort of retrofit and fix up the housing stock we have now?
Yeah, it's hugely important. Most of the buildings that are standing today are still going to be standing. So just on the federal policy side, which I track more closely, the government has come out with some, Canada Infrastructure Bank is working on commercial buildings. There's a grant program and an upcoming loan program that will be available for residents. But, left out of these programs thus far are low income populations, because it's just not reasonable for those families. And that's probably about 20% of the population that we consider to be in what we call energy poverty, who spend a very high amount of their income on energy. They're not going to apply for a loan. They're not going to be able to front the money to then, get a grant. So in Nova Scotia, there's programs that are, no cost to participants. But even in Nova Scotia, which is a leader in the country on this, low-income families under those programs can't get a heat pump, right? Which will be quite, getting those families off of oil should be quite important if with the carbon tax going up to, 170. So if you need a specific approach for low income, and I really congratulate the Affordable Energy Coalition and Lee and Brian Gifford, who have done some work on the specific need for an African Nova Scotian program. That's really great to see, and some excellent work there. And in the chat, I will put in this campaign we're running where people can send a letter to your MP to call for a low-income energy efficiency program, which I see as kind of the biggest policy gap right now on the federal level.
Thanks for that, Brendan. Yeah, I should say, actually, that question was not from Lee. That was a mislabeled Zoom situation. It was from Brian Gifford. So another question I'm going to throw out to everybody here. This one's from Andrew. What are the most effective things we can do as individual Nova Scotians to help propel action against all these systemic problems as soon as possible? What can a person, just home alone, kind of not part of an organization necessarily, an individual Nova Scotian, what can they do? Does anyone have some bright ideas?
I have an idea.
Let's hear it.
I believe we need a major revolution. Not a revolution with a sword, but a revolution with a pen. And since now we have the social media, I believe if there was a way in which we can somehow mobilize all those people that have been forced to be silent, to be able to express their opinions, I think this is one way in which we can be able to feel comfortable that there is a transformative change required. And this is going to be one of the kind of a transformative change that's going to put our province together as a unit, not as something that's just going to look at who has what, but what people should have. Because right now, this division, for example, I can honestly say from an Aboriginal perspective, a lot of our conditions are in the third world conditions. But yet we're supposed to be living in the richest country in the world. Now, why is it those things are allowed to exist in this day of age? So these are the questions, not just the Aboriginal, but any people that have been marginalized. How come they are standing alone on this issue? Where is the rest of the residents? Why are they so silent? Because some of the things that are happening ultimately will affect them one way or the other. So why is so much silence? I'm having difficulty trying to understand that.
Thanks, Albert. Does anyone else want to weigh in on what individual Nova Scotians can do? Caden, go for it.
I would say the biggest thing you can do is have difficult conversations with your friends, with your loved ones, especially conversations around how ability, race, gender, status, class, how all of these intersect. The sooner you sit down at the dinner table with your friends, wherever, and talk about these things, the sooner we can all mobilize together to address these issues. On another note, I mean, for what you can do for groups like mine is show up. And if you can't show up, spread the word. Really, this has always been my perspective on most issues. Maybe it's because I'm such a talker. You just have to talk about it. There's so much silence around so many important issues because they're uncomfortable to talk about, and because they force us to confront our own biases and prejudices we didn't even know we had. So I think that's what everyday Nova Scotians can do, is talk about this. To maybe, I assume anyone who showed up here today at least has some interest in what's going on, but reach out to those who may not be keeping up or may not think that this will affect them, and really extend that olive branch. I don't know if that's the correct saying, but that's what I'm going with. Yeah, and that's all.
Thanks for that, Caden. Jessika, any thoughts? We have just a couple minutes. You want to leave us with anything?
Yeah, I'll be quick. I would say go to the people in your communities that are doing the work and support them. Ask them how they wish to be supported, amplify their voices, amplify the work that is already being done. You know, there are so many extraordinary leaders that have been taking the reins, you know, Louise DeLille, Dr. Lynn Jones, you know, there's so, it's the list is endless. So go to those people, support the work that they are already doing. And then also recognize that it's on everybody to address environmental racism, to address injustice, not just the communities that are impacted. Like Caden said, it's exhausted. We're exhausted. So it requires everybody to lend their voices to do that work. We will continue to call out MPs and leaders of all levels, but if we have backup and we have support, then it's a community project. It's not just the people who are most impacted, because we are all impacted in the end. We all need liberation.
All right. That is a very nice thought to leave it on. I want to thank everyone for participating today. I want to thank the speakers for sharing their knowledge with us. Thank the people who attended the webinar for listening and opening your minds and taking in some of that knowledge coming from our speakers. And I want to thank Noreen Mabiza for organizing this whole affair, and the Ecology Action Center for putting it on. And I'm going to turn it back over to Noreen. Don't leave yet. She has some important messages for us. Noreen, over to you.
Yeah, no, thank you, everyone. That was wonderful, and I enjoyed being able to sit here and listen to every panelist speak. So yeah, like Erica said, I do have one important message. We've all come here tonight and we've been having these conversations, and that's something that has come up is around action, around the little things that we can do. So just as we end this webinar off, I'm going to drop a link in the chat, which is a click to tweet. And this is just a click to tweet where we are welcoming our new environment minister and letting him know that we want to get to work. We want community voices to be heard, and that the time to act is now. So yeah, Rowan in the background is just going to help me and drop that click to tweet, and yeah, just leave enough time for all you folks who are on right now to be able to click that. The tweet will be all typed out and it should be ready to just hit send. Yeah, so thank you to everyone for attending. Thank you, Erica, and it was a great evening.